We're dealing today with and continuing our module on challenges facing the aviation sector. The purpose of our meeting today is to discuss the updates with international aviation and more particularly the challenges facing the entire aviation sector, more particularly air travel. On behalf of the committee, I would like to especially welcome today's meeting Mr. Willie Walsh, Director General, International Air Transport Association, IATA. You're very welcome, Mr. Walsh. Note on privilege. All witnesses are again reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity for naming such as the way to make him or her identifiable, or it, or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of the person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially inflammatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, we direct you to discontinue your remarks. It is pertinent to apply with any such direction. For witnesses attending remotely outside Leinster House campus, there are some limitations to parliamentary privilege and as such may not benefit from the same level of immunity from legal proceedings as witnesses physically present does. Witnesses participating in this committee session from a jurisdiction outside the state are advised that they should also be mindful of their domestic law and how it may apply to the evidence they give. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would like to remind members of the constitutional requirement that members must be physically present within the confines of the place which Parliament has chosen to sit in, namely Leinster House and or the Convention Centre in Dublin, in order to participate in these committee public meetings. Reluctantly, I will not permit a member to participate where they are not adhering to this constitutional requirement. Therefore, any member who attempts to participate from outside the precincts will be asked to leave the meeting. In this regard, I would also ask any members partaking via Teams that prior to making their contribution to the meeting, that you would confirm that you're on the grounds of Leinster House or obviously in the National Convention Centre. For anyone watching this meeting online, Oireachtas members and witnesses are accessing this meeting remotely. Only I, as Chair, and necessary staff censure the running of the meeting physically present in the committee room. Due to these unprecedented circumstances and the large number of people attending the meeting remotely, I'd ask for everyone's forbearance should any technical issue arise. I now call on Mr. Walsh to make your opening statement. And thank you, Mr. Walsh, for taking time out of your busy schedule. Aviation is a critical issue for Ireland, as you're probably well aware, being one of our own. And we are very keen on, as a committee, to look at how we can get the reopening of the aviation sector as quickly as possible in a safe way. So I'll hand over to Mr. Walsh your opening statement.
Very much. Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read through the statement that we have submitted to the committee. I'll take it that the committee has had the opportunity to read that, but just allow me to make a couple of remarks. Without question, this is the most challenging crisis that the airline industry has ever faced. And we have faced some in the past, but nothing on this particular scale. I think it's important to point out that the crisis is ongoing, and it would be wrong to say that it's as a direct result of the global pandemic, because what we face today is a crisis that results from the restrictive travel arrangements, or I have to be honest, in the case of Ireland, what I would describe as a repressive travel policy that is preventing people from travelling. And we can say that with confidence because in markets where restrictions don't apply, we've seen demand recover generally in line with where demand was in 2019, particularly if you look at the US domestic market where travel restrictions do not apply. Traffic is now back to the levels that were seen in 2019, and in some cases actually beginning to exceed those. So what we know is that if these travel restrictions, which were introduced for the right reason at the right time, but if these restrictions are relaxed or removed, we will see a recovery in demand, and that will enable airlines to work their way out of this crisis. What we believe is necessary, particularly in the case of Ireland, is that the EU needs to align in relation to their policies, and we would like to see the EU traffic light system reintroduced and applied consistently across the EU. I have to say, as a proud Irishman and citizen of Europe, I'm disappointed in the way that the EU has managed through this crisis, with many different regimes being adopted by governments, which is causing great confusion in the minds of customers and great problems for airlines seeking to operate. We would also like to see that where people have been vaccinated, that travel restrictions are fully removed. In addition, we think that the quarantine arrangements that have been put in place in Ireland are particularly repressive, and that these quarantine arrangements should be removed and replaced, if necessary, by a risk-based testing system. And I was particularly interested to listen to Professor Ferguson, who appeared before the committee, I think it was last week, and to read comments also from one of the co-authors of the Ferguson report, Paddy Mallon, in relation to the issue of testing. So we believe that there is a case to be made for the use of best-in-class rapid antigen in lieu of expensive and difficult PCR requirements. We also would like to encourage the Irish government to urgently consider the opening of a travel corridor with the United States. This is of particular importance to the Irish economy and the tourism industry in Ireland. And we believe that there's good reason to be optimistic that that could be possible. And last but not least, I think in anticipation of a recovery in the passenger numbers, it's critical that our borders and our border agencies are ready for that increase. Airports will not be able to function properly if people arriving in the country, or indeed having to depart, have to present bits of paper to officials to prove that they meet the requirements. There needs to be a digital solution so that we can continue to process people who have the right qualifications and the right authorizations to enter the country without creating massive queues at the border. So on that, Chairman, I'll pause and allow you to challenge me or ask me any questions that you would like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walsh, and for being so concise. We want to, I suppose, probe with you precisely what are to drill down as to what needs to be put in place now to deal with the issues that you raised, particularly the common travel area with the UK, the whole issue of antigen testing, and maybe when you're doing your deliberations, the issue in terms of the reopening of the US, critical for us in terms of transatlantic. So I'll first go to Fine Gael, to Deputy Joe Corry. Is Deputy Corry there?
Hi, Chairman.
Yeah, Deputy Corry, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chairman.
7 minutes, Deputy Corry.
How long is it,
7
Chairman?
minutes.
7.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Chairman. I want to welcome you, Mr. Walsh, to this important meeting. We've had, a lot of deliberations in the Oireachtas Committee on Transport in relation to trying to get international air travel back up and running. We've produced a many report. You've made reference to Mr. Ferguson's report in relation to antigen. It's something that this committee is advocating strongly for. In terms of, just to give us an overview, if you could, if that's possible, in terms of the current restrictions that are imposed around Europe, and what type of, how would Ireland measure up in terms of other jurisdictions? And if you look at, people traveling to America currently, it's prohibited. America won't let us in there. So obviously you do need a coordinated approach to this, and the digital green cert offers that potential. Work needs to be done there, and I agree wholeheartedly in terms of, the need to open up an air corridor between Europe and the US as well, in tandem with the creation of that digital green cert. If you could give us an overview of what's actually happening across Europe in terms of the restrictions that they have in terms of air travel. You will be aware of the recent announcement by Aer Lingus, a company that you'll be very familiar with, that they're going to close their cabin crew base in Shannon. And just given your background and your standing within aviation, like, it's very clear that Aer Lingus are in a very difficult financial position, and they have received funding from the state in terms of an ISIS loan of 150 million. We are told that they're losing approximately €1 million a day, and there is a need for a more substantial cash injection to be made to the airline to keep them afloat. I'm advocating that any cash injection, any deal that's made between government and Aer Lingus should come with a proviso that the strategic routes that operate out of Shannon, Heathrow, New York and Boston are protected. And also that, there was, when Aer Lingus was sold to IAG, there was a commitment that the Shannon Heathrow slots would be protected for a 7-year period, and that is expiring in September in 2022, and that's signed into the Articles of Association. So,
Corry,
in your view, would it be justified to seek a further extension of the slots in any deal that would be done with Aer Lingus, say that it would be extended for a 10-year period? Perhaps you might come back to me, so Mr. Walsh, on those questions. Thank you.
Mr. Walsh.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree with you in relation to the digital green certificate. I think that would be a step forward. At IATA, we have argued that there should be a common standard so that airlines and governments can fully satisfy themselves that people travelling meet the criteria, and where somebody has been vaccinated, that they can provide evidence of that vaccination. Because regardless of what we might think as to whether vaccination should be a requirement for travel, there will be some countries around the world where they will make it a condition of entry into the country. And we've already heard a number of countries say that that's likely to be the case. So having a robust, verifiable system that can be checked and satisfied is very important. On EU restrictions, I've described the arrangements in Ireland to be repressive. I think I've heard people sort of almost cheer at the fact that Ireland has the most restrictive arrangements, as if that's something good. I don't see it that way. I think this is particularly dangerous for a country like Ireland, where the message being sent is that we don't want people travelling to the country. And for a country that's always been open, dependent on immigration, dependent on foreign investment, I think the message that's been sent out around the world is particularly worrying. Other EU countries don't have similar restrictions. So I'm living in Switzerland now, not an EU country, but I've travelled into Spain without any restriction. You have to do in the case of Spain, actually, an antigen test before you travel. In the case of coming back into Switzerland, you need to have a PCR test. I've travelled to the UK, where there's more restrictive arrangements in place. PCR test is required, or an antigen test, but you can then self-isolate. So there isn't a common standard. And even if you look at requirements for PCR, some countries require it to be taken within 24 hours of travel, some 48, and some 72. So you would think that the EU should be able to align on a simple issue like that. If it's okay for many countries to accept one that's been taken within 72 hours, why isn't it acceptable for all? Some require it to be taken by everybody, including newborn children. Others, like Ireland, I think it's children above the age of 6. In some cases, it's people above the age of 18. So there isn't a common standard being applied across the EU. And some countries are more open than others. But in the main, some element of restriction is in place. On Aer Lingus, I think it's very regrettable that Aer Lingus has had to take the decisions that it has. But you've got to remember, Aer Lingus is not flying on the transatlantic. And the transatlantic operation from Shannon is particularly seasonal. It's always been heavily dependent on US inbound traffic, and particularly so during the summer season. Now, this summer season is wiped out, which is the second summer in a row that Aer Lingus will not be able to bring people from the US into Ireland. And while Irish citizens are restricted in terms of entry into the US at the moment under federal law, there's no restriction on US citizens traveling out of the US or indeed back into the US. So it's deeply regrettable that Aer Lingus has to take this decision, but I don't see any way of avoiding it because it is in a deep financial crisis. And while you're right in saying that Aer Lingus has accessed a loan from ISEF, that is a loan that has to be repaid. So, the damage that has been done to airlines through this crisis is huge in relation to the additional debt burden that has been taken on. And that debt has to be repaid. And that will impose significant restrictions on how airlines operate. And I think it will be particularly true in terms of the risk appetite that they have for financial risk, which will seriously restrict the level of capacity that comes back into the market once travel restrictions are removed. And I don't see, and I've no inside knowledge in terms of how Aer Lingus is thinking, but I don't see how it will be possible for Aer Lingus to recreate the transatlantic network that it operated in 2019 once things get going. I think it's going to take many, many years to see the transatlantic network being built up again. And on relation to Shannon slots, all I can tell you is that, I've always said that people didn't have anything to fear because based on all of the knowledge I had, and again, I don't have any inside knowledge as to how things are operating at the moment, but while I was at Aer Lingus and at IAG, those routes were operated on a profitable basis. So people should have nothing to fear. If the demand is there, I guarantee you Aer Lingus will want to serve it. They always have, and I believe they always will. And people shouldn't be concerned about the continuity of that service, provided the government removes restrictions. If you continue to have travel restrictions, well, then it's inevitable that these routes cannot be operated.
Now move to Deputy O'Murray Sinn Féin slot. Deputy O'Murray, 7 minutes.
Corry, I'd like to welcome Mr. Walsh, and in fairness, I will just go through your opening statement. It's quite comprehensive. If we start with the plans, right? If we move actually into employment support, is the big one. I think we all accept that particularly an island like this, connectivity is paramount. And we were told throughout this entire period that it's all about maintaining the capacity, particularly in aviation, from a point of view, when we get to the tail end of this, that we're able to maintain that connectivity. And within that, also providing protection for workers and their families. So obviously, you're talking about, if we talk in the Irish sense, a continuation of the supports that are there, but even beyond that. So if I could get some detail in relation to that, I'd be thankful. And I suppose a lot of this is about what we can put in place in the present setup in relation to reopening. And you're talking about obviously a resumption of the EU traffic light system and then eventually removing all quarantine requirements. But and we did do a piece of work, as you said yourself, with Professor Ferguson, particularly around antigen testing. Now, what he spoke about were some of the pilots that were operated in Britain specifically, and you're talking about where people would fly in and it would be serial testing where they would test themselves over, let's say, 10 days or whatever period. Like we have called that there would be pilots done in relation to this during this period in time, so we at least have that bit of heavy lifting done, and we have contacted government and the Minister for Transport in relation to this happening. Now, we obviously have the worry at the minute, like we heard from England's Chief Medical Officer in relation relation to the possibility of the Indian variant overtaking the Kent variant. Like, we hope that this doesn't impact that, you know what I mean, in relation to vaccinations and protection, but it is a worry. So I suppose we have to take that into account as we do that, and I suppose let's remember on some level that it's COVID that has done this to us. But I do think, and I think you'll be in agreement, that we do need to look into the likes of the digital green certificate and the rapid antigen tests from a point of view of giving us choice. But I'm interested in relation to the American corridor, and I accept the importance and our relationship with America. But I wonder, has there been any communication at the other end? Because, like, they obviously have restrictions in relation to us flying out at this point in time, and I get that with the passing of every couple of weeks, like, we have a significant amount of people who will be vaccinated within this general area, so that will allow more freedom in relation to what can be done. So if you could give me an answer in relation to that.
Thank you, Deputy. And I would agree with you. I think employment support has been critical, and I have to acknowledge that if it were not for the employment support provided by governments, not just in Ireland, but in other countries as well, I think the scale of unemployment in the airline industry would be massive. Really, what we were hoping for was that we would be able to keep people in employment, critical skills in place to enable the industry to restart and restart quickly. As this period of restriction has extended well beyond what anybody had expected, and the damage that has been done to the industry, significantly greater than anybody had expected. I think the ability for the industry to recover to the 2019 levels of capacity quickly is now impossible. I think it will take several years. And the reason I say that is, we have seen a lot of aircraft have been retired, so therefore the aircraft are not available. A lot of critical staff, unfortunately, have been made redundant. Many more would have been made redundant if it weren't for the employment support scheme. So I think we've got to be very thankful and recognise the support that governments have provided. It does enable airlines to get moving again, but not to the same scale that I would have hoped for, had we been having this conversation 6 months ago. I do remain optimistic that we will be able to see a recovery in the second half of this year, and that's principally based on the accelerated rollout of the vaccine and the scientific evidence that the vaccine is having a significant impact on the levels of transmission. It's definitely dampening down the levels of transmission as a result of vaccination. The serial antigen testing, I was very interested to listen to Professor Ferguson when he appeared before the committee. I'm not so sure I would support the view that you need to be tested every day, but I think a risk-based approach to testing is a very sensible suggestion, and I read the recommendation of the committee in relation to that, and it would be great to see the government act upon your recommendation. But I think what is important is, if you look at the data now, I don't have as much data about Ireland because it's not as readily available, but the UK is providing a lot of data now. And if I look at a 6-week period, I'll just refer to my notes here. This is the latest data I have between the 25th of March and the 5th of May. 150,000, just over 150,000 people travelled into the UK and either had to go into a hotel quarantine, similar to Ireland, or had to self-isolate. Now, of those 150,000 people, they were all required to do a PCR test on or before day 2 of their arrival in the UK. 3,749, based on the data that has been published, showed a positive indication. That's 2.5%. Interestingly, if you remove those who travelled from India and Pakistan, who accounted for 20% of the people travelling, but over 50% of the people who tested positive, the rate at which the positivity rate was 1.5%. To put it in another way, a more positive way, 98.5% of people were perfectly fine, had no virus, were not contagious. but did suffer restrictions as a result. Now, the figures I've seen for Ireland, it's a much smaller sample, and I'm not sure if these are up to date, but I think it was something like 3% of people who have gone into hotel quarantine have subsequently tested positive. 97% of people who were forced to pay over 1,800 euros for the pleasure of being locked in a hotel for 2 weeks were fine. Now, if you're going to assess these measures, you have to look at what is the risk, because we can't have a zero risk approach. That's just, unachievable. So, what people have to do is satisfy themselves that they are accepting a reasonable level of risk. And I think that can be done without the measures that have been put in place. The quality of testing has significantly improved. I don't know how many PCR tests you've done. I've done 10 in the last 2 months associated with the travel I've been doing. I've also done several antigen tests. Fortunately, I've tested negative every time. But nobody wants to have to go through that just for the privilege of exercising their freedom of movement, which is a fundamental principle of the EU. That's really what has upset me most. So I agree with your assessment and the committee's recommendation in relation to replacing forced quarantine with a sensible system of serial testing, be that on a daily basis. I'm sure people wouldn't mind if there was an alternative to hotel quarantine, or every second day. And I think that would represent a very sensible risk-based approach to the problem that we face.
And just very quickly, because thanks for the comprehensive answer, but it was just in relation to the corridor and America, and whether there had been communication to the other end where they have their own restrictions.
Briefly, Mr. Walsh.
I've had some discussions with the US Department of Transportation. Their concern is how they can satisfy themselves that where people have been vaccinated, that they can be assured that that is accurate. And this is where I think the digital green certificate comes into play. I think that provides the guarantee that governments would be looking for. So I think there is a solution available.
And a bit of IT work to be done to ensure we're ready for action.
Thanks, Deputy Murgo.
We have to do that,
moving now to Fianna Fáil, Deputy Cathal Crowe. 7 minutes, Deputy Crowe.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to thank Mr. Walsh for attending our meeting here today. So, look, just at the outset, I want to say we've had devastating news yesterday with the announcement that Aer Lingus, an airline which has a constant presence in Shannon since 1958, will permanently close its base there. Absolutely devastating for the 130 employees based at Shannon, devastating for the region too, and devastating for aviation. There's a few things I want to say. First of all, there's a lot of work to be done. We will go down fighting here because I know that the Taoiseach is going to meet the airline tomorrow. I know the airline are again coming back looking for some support, some government, and I think that absolutely has to be conditional on some things. There is no blank cheque territory here in terms of funds, whether it's in grant format or whether it's in repayable loan format via ISIF. There is no blank cheque territory here. There has to be some conditionality built into this, and I think that has to involve commitments to routes out of Shannon, but also to the base in Shannon. Just a few things I want to say about yesterday's announcement, Chairman. First of all, the Cabinet were to meet yesterday. You have to look at the chronology of all this, because the Cabinet were to meet yesterday to look at two things. The scaling back of mandatory hotel quarantine, which can't happen soon enough. It had a purpose in early January when 8,000 or so cases of COVID a day. It doesn't have a purpose now. So they were to meet yesterday to look at that. They were also meeting to look at digital green certificate and a pathway forward to a resumption of international air travel. So that's what was on the Cabinet agenda yesterday. That's the day Aer Lingus chose to make this announcement. They have availed of the EWSS salary support for the past 14 months. Practically all of the Aer Lingus wage bill has been paid for by government. The government has skin in the game here. They may not own the airline, and that day is gone, but they have skin in the game, and they need to call in that as well. Just want to mention a few things. The digital green certificate will again be before Cabinet next week for and we're getting to that final ratification stage. It has to be said time and time again, this has to be ratified by 27 member states. And this is an EU-wide protocol, and there isn't a case of Ireland being a laggard in this regard. This is an EU-wide set of regulations. There's a 6-week or so political run-in here. There's about a 6-week period from ratification across the EU to implementation. What I want to ask Mr. Walsh, first of all, is that 6-week political lead-in, does that align itself with the lead-in periods that IATA and all the airlines that you represent, does that align itself with the lead-in period that they need in terms of having pilots back in hours, cabin crew back and certified, and marketing plans up in place? Does that 6-week period align itself? Because it seems to me the logical thing here to say, on Tuesday, when the Cabinet meet and when we start a ratification process in Ireland, that Minister Eamon Ryan should come out and say, you know, you're in the starting blocks. This is your 6-week lead-in period. This is our 6-week lead period. Politically, let's get this all aligned. Does that align itself perfectly for your industry? Could you tell us, please?
Yeah, I think it's a good comment, provided there's certainty that after the 6-week lead-in period, things will restart again. I think what's going to kill the industry completely is if we have this reopening and then closing of borders again, because you know the damage that's being done is very significant. The real challenge airlines face, and this is particularly true of Aer Lingus, the cash burn that the airline faces, which is significant, will actually increase as the airline starts to get back up and running again. Because you have a combination of costs that they're not currently incurring, such as fuel, airport charges, en route charges, that will now become payable at the same time as they're waiting for the revenue stream from bookings to come into place. So for a lot of airlines, actually the most challenging period is not what we've come through, it's what we're actually facing. And part of that will be the risk associated with getting going too fast. Now, I know you didn't ask me a question in relation to financial support for Aer Lingus, but just allow me to comment. Anybody taking out a loan will have to assess the conditions associated with that loan, not just the financial conditions, but all of the other red tape, and then satisfy themselves that it makes sense. You can put all the conditions you like, but that doesn't mean the loan will be accepted. And it doesn't mean that, therefore, you have a strong card to play. What you've got to do, and this is, I'm sure, what the management team at Aer Lingus is looking at, is you've got to provide certainty that if Aer Lingus starts operating on the transatlantic again, it will be able to continue to do so, because the costs associated with ramping up a transatlantic operation are massive. And it's that period that the greatest risk is being taken. So, if I were looking at additional debt being taken on by the airline, I would be very, very careful about the conditions associated with that, because the balance sheet has been significantly stressed and the debt that has been taken on has to be repaid. And for that debt to be repaid, the airline will have to be profitable. And you cannot impose non-commercial, restrictive covenants on an airline and hope that it'll be in a position to repay the debt. So you need to be very careful. I don't see how Aer Lingus can sensibly guarantee the operation of a Shannon transatlantic base, given that the summer season has effectively been lost yet again, and the very significant seasonality associated with the transatlantic operation into Shannon. I agree with you. I think it's really sad to see it, and it's terrible for everybody involved. These decisions are not taken. These decisions are not taken lightly by airline management. Many of these decisions have been forced upon them because of the financial crisis that they face at the moment.
Just to thank you, Mr. Walsh, just to extend my comment there, Chairman. Look, the reality is that the 130 employees based out of Shannon have largely had their salaries paid by the government, and that's the point I'm making. The taxpayer has more or less paid the wage bill for the Shannon employees. So the government, on that basis, should have some say. If they're going to be paying the wage bill, they should have some conditionality built into it that those employees would be at least strategically based out of the Shannon base. I absolutely get the point here, but I think there is, there's no deflecting blame here, because mandatory hotel quarantine, as I said, had a purpose during peak COVID, 8,000 cases a day. We're now tapered back to 300 or so cases a day. It doesn't have a purpose now, but mandatory hotel quarantine has been a catalyst to where we're at today. But the reality is that Aer Lingus senior management also seized an opportunity presented to it by a crisis to withdraw from Shannon. And I just think the timing of it is chronic. No. It was the day that this came before Cabinet. It's on the eve of things reopening. There's about 5 or 6 weeks before planes are back in the sky. So there's a bit of that too. And there's certain actions that government are going to take, and that's already happening. The Taoiseach is to meet with them tomorrow. But also, I think there needs to be certain hardballing with Aer Lingus here as well, because they have done well out of their wage bill has been absolutely paid, by government. They also have shown very little loyalty to their staff base in Shannon, because there's again that carrot been hanging over staff there since yesterday that you'll be transferred to Dublin possibly. That won't happen, because the reality is when they looked at temporary layoffs within their workforce, they held on to some staff that had only come in the door 10 or 11 weeks before the COVID pandemic onset. But they laid off staff that had been in Shannon 30 or 35 years. They showed loyalty at each occasion to Dublin and Cork over Shannon. And that just needs to be stated. We're supportive of Aer Lingus, and I will do absolutely everything as a TD in the county of Clare, also as my party's aviation spokesperson. Night and day will work for this, but we need to just call out some of those truths as well, Chairman.
And we will be putting those to Aer Lingus when they're in before us as well. Can I just move on? Mr. Walsh, just my own slot. So I just wanted to ask a few things. Number one, have you met government? Have you met the Irish government? And at what level have you met in terms of giving your overview on aviation, which is such a pinnacle, important sector for our economy?
Personally, no, I haven't. This is the first opportunity I've had, but I've only been in position here at IATA for 6 weeks.
I think it would be very important that you meet government. It's something that we'd work with you on. Secondly, you spoke about Ireland having the most oppressive travel policy anywhere in the world. I might just elaborate on that. And in that context, the government are about to announce a reopening plan for aviation. So what are the benchmarks you want to see? You spoke about certainty. I'm a TD for Limerick City. Shannon is hugely important to us. But I believe there is a question here of if the aviation sector can reopen, I would like to see goodwill from Shannon to resume both the Heathrow and the transatlantic and the cabin crew in Shannon. But I think until such a time as aviation is up and running, it's more difficult to have those discussions. So what do you, and take into account the resumption of the travel common area with ourselves in the UK. You spoke about the US. When do you anticipate, you spoke about the digital green cert and vaccination, but when do you anticipate Joe Biden as President of America and his government and the officials will look to allow people to fly to the US from Europe without the restrictions? And so that we're at a point, and you might just map it out. The digital green cert is coming in the end of June. You're looking at a period, a 6-week lead-in period. And what's the latest time that aviation needs to get the green light so it can actually survive? So I know I'm drilling down, but I think we need to get into detail. So you could just give me a map out. Why is Ireland, do you regard us as an outlier? What do you want to see in the government's reopening plan that's realistic? Because at the end of the day, there is public health issues here. And how would you see it operating with your members in terms of public health, flying in and out of the UK, flying in and out of transatlantic, time frame involved, linking in with the digital green cert and other measures like PCR and rapid antigen testing? Thank you, Mr. Walsh.
Okay, thank you. When I say the Irish government is the most repressive, you had mandatory hotel quarantine for over 70 countries. You still have mandatory hotel quarantine for a number of countries. Take a couple of examples. The US, if I look at the data that the UK has provided in that 6-week period that I talked about, the positivity rate, the number of people travelling into the UK from the US was 0.7%. 34 people tested positive for coronavirus. 34 people, 99% plus had no virus at all, yet you're locking them up in hotels. That's repressive. France, 32 people travelling from France into the UK tested positive, yet they're being locked up in hotels in Ireland. Nobody travelling into the UK from Belgium tested positive, yet if you travel into Ireland, you're being locked up. And nobody tested positive from Luxembourg. So there's just 4 countries where I give you an example of hard data. So for some reason, the Irish government has decided that these people represent a significant risk to Ireland. I disagree, and disagree strongly. And I'm not being paid by Aer Lingus, and haven't been for some time, or indeed by IAG. But I reject the statements that have been made in relation to Aer Lingus, and they will be able to defend themselves. But it's an airline that lost over 360 million euros last year and over 100 million euros in the first quarter of this year. They're not being opportunistic. They're being desperate about the measures that they're taking, as are airlines right across the world, being faced with very, very tough decisions. And, I've been in tough positions before. These are not easy decisions to take. People don't take them lightly. They are looking at the future survival of the airline, and they've got to take decisions that can, at best, guarantee that they can do that. In relation to the US, I think you've raised a very, very important issue. But for Ireland, the most critical issue is to get US people travelling into Ireland. I know it would be great to see Irish people travelling to the US. Now, the US has made clear that they will allow their citizens travel internationally and return to the US without restriction if they've been vaccinated. So straight away, you could approve that tomorrow. But what Ireland is saying is, if you're vaccinated and you travel from the US into Ireland, you're going to have to pay over 1,800 euros, and we're going to lock you up in a hotel for 12 days, escort you there, courtesy of the Irish
Mr.
Army,
Walsh,
and make sure you don't leave.
Mr. Walsh,
That's
tomorrow,
oppressive.
you want quarantine lifted. What should it be? What should it be replaced by?
Well, if these people are vaccinated and you believe in the science and you believe in the story that we've been told, that the key to getting out of all of these restrictions rests with having a vaccination policy, well, then these restrictions should be removed as we see widespread vaccination. And the level of vaccination in the US is very high. So straight away, why do you want to lock up people who have been fully vaccinated when the evidence, the scientific evidence shows that vaccination does suppress the transmission of the virus?
And if the Irish authorities lifted quarantine, which I think we as a committee believe it should, and it replaced it initially with rapid PCR testing for anyone coming into Ireland, whether they're vaccinated or not. We as a committee favour that they need to look at rapid antigen testing, but if PCR testing, to have a negative PCR test within 72 hours of arriving from the US, would that work?
If the requirement is to have a PCR test before you travel, so the cost of a PCR test varies. We've done some research on this in IATA, from $27 to $280. There's clear evidence that people are taking advantage, going back to the comments from Deputy Crow, taking advantage of this crisis to profit on the back of mandated PCR testing. So, if PCR testing is required, the price should be significantly lower. But, if that is a requirement of entry, a test within 72 hours of arriving, I don't think that will inhibit people from travelling.
And then can you just
misrepresented me, Mr. Walsh.
Can you just follow on for me on over the next 2 months, 3 months, in terms of what you want to see in a reopen plan tomorrow, be it on a phased basis on the common travel area where testing would work, and then linking into transatlantic, and what are the dates that it must happen so that the airline business can recover, and we see the likes of Aer Lingus re-engaging in Shannon Airport in terms of flights and cabin crew being based there. So can you just give us...
In my opinion, in relation to Shannon, you're too late. Because, we're now nearly at the end of May, to try and sell in the US market, to change the attitude, to make sure that US people here that Ireland is welcome, because the story over there is if you travel to Ireland, you're being locked up. So you have a job to do, both as a country and as a tourism industry.
Tell me, Mr. Walsh, what would you like to see in the reopening plan announced by government tomorrow in terms of time frame and procedurally flying within the common travel area in the UK and transatlantic in Europe?
That you can do it from tomorrow without restriction. I don't see why there is a restriction. If you're in the UK, the majority of people in the UK have been vaccinated. The level of virus in the UK is very, very low. There's no restriction.
And what about Europe? Europe?
Yeah, Europe. If you want a time frame, give a signal that it's within weeks. But if you're talking about months, it's far too late.
And transatlantic?
Transatlantic. You should welcome US visitors to Ireland from tomorrow.
And then finally, at what point do you get, in terms of the reopening of the aviation sector, in terms of government announcement, when do you go past almost a no-return date for the aviation sector in terms of a time frame?
I think there are a lot of airlines that will struggle to stay in business given that it's extended to this period. I think many airlines are in a position to get going again. But if this continues into the second half of this year, I would have grave concerns for quite a number of airlines. So
you're talking July, August?
I'm thinking from July, yeah. We need to see evidence of the industry moving in July.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I'll now move to back to the Sinn Féin slot. Deputy O'Rourke, 7 minutes. Sorry, Deputy O'Rourke, rather, 7 minutes.
I think I'm going to be taking a chair. Deputy O'Rourke is at a briefing.
That's the case, Deputy O'Rourke, on that basis, because I have so many members, I'll have to pass and I'll go. The next Fianna Fáil slot, Senator Jerry Harkin, 7 minutes. And if Deputy O'Rourke, is he coming to today's meeting?
He's at a briefing by Minister Ryan on the NCSE and the ransomware attack. So the minute that's over, he'll be in.
Well, then I'll allow him to come in. Deputy Harkin.
Thanks for
Senator Harkin.
demoting me or whatever. But thanks, Deputy O'Donnell, former Senator O'Donnell, and thank you very much, Mr. Walsh, for joining us today. As growing up, I would have seen your rise. I remember you were in Futura, I think, at the time before you came back to Aer Lingus and on to British Airways and IAG, and here you are in IATA. So it's great to see another Irish person doing so well in the international aviation industry, despite their challenges and their across the sector. And I suppose there's been a lot of people will be talking about Shannon for very obvious reasons, and it is very regrettable, the decision that had to be taken. And I do understand that the angst in the region, and it's so important, Shannon, for that region. But if I can maybe focus a little bit on just if you were the Minister for Transport, if you were head of government, you've given us your opening statement. What are the 3 or 4 things you would do in the next week, the next 10 days to get the aviation industry back up and running? I mean, I think from a connectivity point of view, all over Europe, people can jump. We forget sometimes people can jump on trains. They can get from country to country without going to an airport. We can't. We have a population of less than 5 million people, and we have 33 million people in the normal times going through Dublin Airport, more than 6 times our state's population. I don't think you'll find too many other countries in the world that have those ratios. So can you have outlined some of it in your statement, but the 3, 4, 5 things you can do, you're an aviation expert, I think that's without parallel. What do you need us to do to make sure that we have connectivity in the long run? Because from an FDI perspective, from a tourism inwards perspective, but equally from a population perspective, Irish people do like to travel. They do like to visit other countries. They do have a huge diaspora across the world that they want to get back in touch with, and they want them coming here. What do you want us to do, literally almost week by week for the next 3 to 4 weeks, to get aviation back up to somewhere approaching where it was before? And how long maybe do you think it will be, or do you see us ever getting back in the next 5 to 10 years back to 2019 figures? Thanks.
Walsh.
Great question. I think we're likely to get back to 2019 in 2024. So it probably will take 5 years, maybe at the earliest 2024, more likely it'll take 5 years from now, 2026, given where we are. What I would like to see are some of the issues I've outlined already. I think there has to be a signal that the mandatory hotel quarantine is finished. If it's required, it should be required in extreme circumstances. It can't be that it becomes the norm, which in effect it has become. I think Ireland has to align with the rest of Europe in terms of having a sensible traffic light system. I think Ireland should use its position of influence within Europe to try and get a common position adopted across the EU, particularly in a post-Brexit environment. It's disappointing to see the EU fragmented the way it is. I think Ireland needs to look at a testing regime that is risk-based and therefore, take on board the recommendation that your committee has made in relation to rapid antigen as opposed to expensive PCR. And I think you've got to make sure, in anticipation of getting back moving again, that when people do arrive at airports, that they have a smooth passage into and out of the airport. And that will require, some technology. It will require the adoption of some form of digital system to allow people to do that in an efficient manner. But we've got to change the attitude in Ireland where travel is seen as an evil, and I don't understand that, given how critical it has been to the growth of the Irish economy. It has enabled people both in the island and outside to do business in a way that wouldn't have been possible. We've been massively successful in attracting business into Ireland, but if you don't have access to the island, I really do worry about the businesses that have relocated here, whether they're going to look at other parts of the world. And I can tell you, I'm doing that from my own point of view here at IATA, because there are some countries where I have offices where they're making it very difficult for us to work. So we're already looking at, can we relocate those offices to a more business-friendly environment? So I think Ireland needs to move and move fast. And I can understand, the political risk associated with making decisions like this. But, I come from an airline background where we have to manage risk on a daily basis. It's in our DNA, and we do it well, and we understand how to manage risk. But, it is going to be important to make change and make change quickly. The damage that's being done is significant and is increasing every day.
Thanks very much. I mean, I suppose in terms of Ireland's going forward, from a Dublin Airport Authority perspective, from an Irish, from the Minister, the Minister of Tourism and the Minister of Transport happen to be separate people at the moment. They weren't always. But from both their perspectives, in terms of connectivity, but also in terms of inbound tourism, which massively, regardless of where they land, it's so important that we have tourists bringing in their dollars or euros, wherever, into the country. What do we need to be doing to make sure those airlines that, as you've mentioned, it's sad to see these graveyards in Spain and France and in the desert with thousands and thousands of large aircraft parked and which may never really fly again. Airlines are going to be smaller, I think. Well, I'm asking you the question. Yeah. It looks like airlines will be smaller than they were for a long time to come. They will have to choose from their resources where they fly to and why they fly to where they fly to. What can we do as a country, or what do we need to do as a country to ensure that fabulous connectivity we had previously gets back sooner rather than later?
No, you've hit the nail on the head. Airlines will be smaller, and therefore they will have to look at where they assign the assets that they have, which are less than they used to have. And I think Ireland today would be very, very low on the list, given everything I've said in terms of the restrictions. And these decisions are being taken now, because there are airlines who are looking at countries and markets that are beginning to open. And you've seen what's happened in the UK with Portugal going on the green list, the amount of capacity that's gone into Portugal. They're not going to take that capacity out of Portugal and put it into Ireland. It's going to stay in Portugal. And the next country that opens up is going to get more capacity. And that's what's going to happen. And if Ireland is at the end of the queue, there's going to be very little capacity made available to Ireland. And That means inbound tourism is going to be significantly choked. The outbound connectivity is going to be significantly inhibited. So that's why I say it's urgent that government needs to move quickly on these, because I can guarantee you, if the UK adds another 3 countries to their green list tomorrow, airlines that have capacity will put those aircraft into those markets, and they are potentially aircraft that may have gone into Ireland. So the sooner we do it, the better. And we are lagging behind. We're lagging significantly behind the UK, and we're lagging behind several other countries in Europe who have already come out and stated that they will allow people with vaccination to travel in and out without restriction, or they will remove quarantine for people who can show evidence of a negative test. We've got to get back in line with other countries.
Okay, just final question then, Chairman. I suppose from an IATA perspective, I think you're muted there. From an IATA perspective, obviously that's who you're representing now, which includes IAG, your former employer, including Aer Lingus, and also I suppose the great enemy over the years of Aer Lingus, Ryanair. Ryanair have moved relocated aircraft out of Ireland. Aer Lingus even are relocating aircraft to Manchester.
Senator Hoffman, you'll have to conclude, please.
So I will conclude now. Just I suppose that's my last point, is the challenge. If even Irish registered based aircraft are moving out of Ireland, I suppose you need to just tell us and emphasise to us how devastating that will be long term if we don't take action soon.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you've made the point very well. These are aircraft that we're operating in the Irish market that will now operate in the UK market, and every day that passes, more of those aircraft are likely to be assigned to the UK or elsewhere. Particularly in the case of Ryanair, who have incredible flexibility, to relocate their aircraft right across Europe.
Thanks.
So that is the risk.
Thanks, Mr.
Okay, thank you,
We'll now
Chairman. Thank you,
move
Mr.
to Deputy Smith. Deputy Smith, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Walsh, for addressing our committee today. You have a unique perspective on the aviation industry, given your history both with our flag carrier and IAG and where you're at now. If I could just, I totally agree with the points that you make in relation to believing the science. I mean, we have a vaccination rollout that is working and that people have confidence in. We've had PCR tests which have been gold standard for over a year since the start of this pandemic. But we've had the Professor Ferguson report, which this committee spoke about and endorsed the findings of in terms of rapid antigen testing and what needs to be done there. And then we also have a year's plus of global personal behaviour, understanding how to live with this virus, and that's something that needs to be taken on board. What Ireland went through in December, January and February, I think, was quite unique to Europe at the time. It was very bad, and decisions were made during that time that are quite restrictive, and what we need now, given where we are with the science, is a roadmap out of that. On mandatory hotel quarantine, I think we need a roadmap to wind this down to be a measure of last resort, because we have the science and we have the vaccinations and we have the testing capacity in place to make that happen. So that's something that needs to occur. Could I just ask a couple of questions in relation to testing? I mean, I was on the COVID committee last year, and this transport committee, we've done a huge amount of work in terms of trying to promote a testing regime within our airports and within our aviation industry. And we were always met with a rebuff from government on that. Could you just comment on your view of the calls for airport and aviation testing and the kind of obstacles that you saw over the last year, and how the impact of that? Secondly, could the government here have done more to protect jobs in Aer Lingus in terms of the supports that were given? There was conditionality given for job protection in the likes of Germany and Spain and France for state supports, and I'm asking that from the point of view of how Aer Lingus operates in the IAG family. And I'm not saying it's a simplistic thing, but could more have been done to ensure that support that we're given, and with 150 million of a loan given to the ISIL fund to Aer Lingus, could more have been done to protect the jobs that have been lost? And finally, in terms of the digital green cert, which is something we all want to see work and work well, do you have any concerns in relation to the European capacity for an effective IT regime to ensure that this works and works well from the start, again, because this is all about having confidence in this early on, because we all want to support it and get it off the ground. I'd appreciate your comments and answers on those issues, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think testing has progressed significantly. You know, I go back to 12 months ago when we were doing PCR tests first off, and antigen tests weren't really developed to a standard that would be considered acceptable. I think the advances that have been made now, both in terms of the quality of the testing, the speed of testing, and the assurance that people can get from testing has been really significant. You've got to admire, you know, the science associated both with the vaccine and with the testing. And I think, you know, a standard that we believed was acceptable 12 months ago or necessary 12 months ago shouldn't be necessary today, because there have been so many developments, both in terms of the vaccination, the quality of treatment that we can give in our hospitals. You know, the fear that we had 12 months ago that the health systems would be overrun, and I know it came close at times, but those fears have significantly abated. And the fact that, you know, the most vulnerable in most countries have been vaccinated at this stage. So therefore, you know, the quality or the quantity of risk, whichever way you want to talk about it, has changed. And therefore, the mitigation action that you should put in place to address that has changed, because you want to end up with the same, you know, residual level of risk. And I think we can do that with a cheaper, more efficient, more comfortable type of test than, you know, PCR. And I know the scientists disagree on this, which is great to see, you know, that they can't all agree. You know, I've seen some thinking that rapid antigen should not be used at all, and others who say it's clearly an effective way of testing people, particularly testing somebody who is positive. Doesn't necessarily guarantee that if you have a negative result, you're negative, but it pretty much does guarantee if you have a positive result, you are positive. So I think testing has progressed. You ask a great question in relation to could more have been done to protect jobs. I suppose it's always easy to look back and say we could have done more or we could have done better. I can't be too critical. You know, I have to admit I'm a great admirer of the Minister for Finance, Minister Donoghue, who I think has done a fantastic job and has responded as best he could in the circumstances, and has a very challenging position going forward. You know, the loan from ISIF is a commercial loan made on commercial terms. It's great to have ISIF, and as you know, I was for a number of years chairman of the NTMA, which included responsibility for ISIF, so I understand how ISIF operates and the steps that Aer Lingus would have had to go through to satisfy ISIF that was a loan that was worth making and a loan that would be repaid. To be honest, the thing that would have protected jobs more than anything is to get international travel going again. I know it's a simple answer for me to give, but it really is. Jobs can best be protected by the airline operating. And, you know, the sooner we get the airline operating, particularly during this, what is traditionally the peak summer period, the better. If we miss this summer period, then I can tell you the situation becomes, you know, much more grave, because we're going into what is traditionally a low demand winter period, you know, which I think will be particularly dangerous for a number of airlines. So, you know, I welcome the support that governments across the world have given. Most of that support has been in the form of debt, and that's why if you look at the industry, the debt burden on the airline industry, we estimate at IATA to be $650 billion US, 220 billion additional debt through this, and that's increasing by the day. And it's also, you know, important to point out that most of the financing that airlines have accessed has come from the debt and equity markets. So shareholders have put in their fair stake, and the commercial debt market has been accessed. So what governments have been providing is a small fraction of what the industry has had to access, but it's very, very welcome. And without it, I think a number of airlines would have been in severe trouble if it hadn't been made available.
We'll now
Thank you. Could you just would you be able to just have a quick comment on my last question? I think regarding, do you have any concerns about the capacity for?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Great question. I would have to say we don't. We're developing within IATA what we call the IATA Travel Pass, and we're doing this principally for the industry, but a lot of the work that we're doing can be done on behalf of governments as well. Now, it requires a central database. It doesn't have to be the digital Green Pass. So in Ireland, there is a database available for people who have been vaccinated. The UK, you have a database. It would be great to have one across the EU. But in most cases, we can access data that is reliable. And we have the app developed that can be used. We've got so far about 110 airlines have signed up to use it. We're in discussions with a number of governments already. I think we have 8 or 9 governments who have said they will be using it. We're in discussions with 30 other governments who are interested in using it as a system to enable people to demonstrate that they have met the requirements. So, I think, it is possible, if not within, governments or relying on governments. I think the public sector, the private sector working together can provide an IT solution.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Thank you, Chair, for that allowance at the end. Thank you.
We'll now move to the regional group. I inadvertently mixed them up with the independent group, but nevertheless, I'm not correcting the matter. So, Deputy McNamara is substituting for Senator Crockwell. Deputy McNamara, 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair. Mr. Walsh, thank you very much for your presentation. You're somebody with a lot of experience in running an airline. Can you tell me what practical import there is from the closure of a base? Obviously, it doesn't mean that Aer Lingus will no longer fly in and out of Shannon Airport, but it does have implications, in particular, I understand, for early morning flights and late evening flights. Can you maybe explain that a little bit, please?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. If you've got to crew the base from outside, it typically would mean that the aircraft and the crew are starting from another base, which means the first departure depends on the first arrival, which typically means that the first departure will be later than if you had people based in the airport. So, yeah, it does have implications in terms of the timing of the schedule that would be operated. And I think you're right. As I say, I don't have any inside knowledge as to what Aer Lingus is thinking about. I would imagine and expect that they will continue to operate from Shannon, but the shape of the schedule and the level of activity will be very different to what has been normal at Shannon.
So typically it would be, thank you very much. So typically it would be difficult to provide the type of flights, for example, that business passengers would typically get, which are early in the morning, late at night. It's
more expensive to some degree. You can provide them, but normally what it means is you're overnighting crew in hotels rather than having them based there. And in many cases, that's what airlines do when there is insufficient activity at the base to justify having people based there. So, Aer Lingus have early morning departures, or certainly they did have early morning departures from a number of European cities, but the crew aren't based there. They operate a late flight in from, Ireland and an early departure, but they stay in a hotel. So it's not impossible to do it. So I wouldn't say business people will lose out, but it does impact on the schedule because it makes it more complex than if you have people and aircraft based there.
And obviously, if you have to make choices, it makes it a less attractive choice.
Exactly.
From the point of view of airport management, or not airport management, rather airline management. And the slots that were guaranteed that my colleague Deputy Corry alluded to at the very beginning of this, at Heathrow are of considerable value. They're guaranteed. You seem to indicate that you didn't think there was any particular threat to them immediately, but are they time, are those slots at a particular time? Are they not early morning and late evening slots into and out of Heathrow, which would be particularly valuable given the demand for business passenger flights in and out of Heathrow, because, well, obviously it's in London?
Yeah, a great question again, and I have to remind the committee that that guarantee was extracted from me under significant pain from Minister Donoghue, who made it a condition of the deal to acquire the Aer Lingus shares that the government held.
There were, of course, some who thought that you got much better value than Minister Donoghue did at the time, but that's a different question.
Well, I think the measure is that Michael O'Leary sold the shares as well, and normally he would be regarded, and I certainly regard him as one of the best business people in the world. So, he didn't do any better. In fact, he got more. Minister Donoghue got more guarantees than Michael did. So, yeah, but you're right, and in fact, you may remember that. The slots that Aer Lingus had when IAG required them didn't include an early morning departure out of Shannon. It was changed because clearly IAG has access to a lot of slots at Heathrow and was able to, shuffle their slot portfolio to give a better departure time from Shannon into London, an early morning departure, which from memory proved to be particularly attractive and made a big difference to the profitability of the route. So that remains the case with Aer Lingus as part of IAG. They have access to the slot pool that IAG holds through British Airways, Iberia, Vueling, and Aer Lingus at Heathrow, and they can play around with them to make the most efficient use of the slot. So I don't think there's a particular risk. If business recovers, and I think it will. I'm pretty sure that there will be a Heathrow slot out of Shannon, because certainly from my experience, that was a very successful way of operating out of Shannon.
Okay, but then obviously there was additional connectivity agreed to Barcelona and Paris, which, I mean, one would expect that it's not going to be business as usual straight away, that that airports are going to consolidate around key hubs, and for Aer Lingus that's Dublin and perhaps increasingly Manchester rather than Shannon and Cork. Am I correct in saying, from a state's point of view, that there is nothing, obviously Ireland's not a Schengen state. Schengen states are going to allow American passengers who are vaccinated and can show they're vaccinated in pretty soon, but there's nothing to stop Ireland doing that tomorrow morning for persons who are vaccinated, nor is there anything. There are a number of EU member states who are allowing passengers who are either vaccinated or can demonstrate that they have an immunity through having contracted COVID and recovered from it. Greece, for example, I think most southern EU states are essentially allowing flights as of now. I mean, there's nothing to stop us. It's merely being hostage to the zero COVID fanatics in Ireland.
I agree with you. There's nothing to stop the Irish government, and in fact, the common travel area, isn't something that would inhibit it either, because I suspect the UK and the US will reach agreement on arrangements there that will allow vaccinated people to travel as well, given the rate of vaccination in both countries. But no, I don't see anything that would stop the Irish government moving immediately on that issue.
Okay. Lastly, you're a businessman. Businessmen take risks. Most of the risks that you've taken have paid off. But you can't live in a zero risk world. I mean, it's just simply impossible. How do you account? You're also an Irishman, so you understand Ireland and clearly Irish politics from your multiple references to and the fact that you were chairman of a state board, of course. How do you account for how Ireland became captured by the whole zero COVID crew in a way that no other European country was, and that we became so understandably frightened of COVID, but completely risk averse, that we were frightened of COVID to the exclusion of almost anything else? It seemed impossible almost to have any other consideration in Ireland for a number of months.
I'm totally amazed. I cannot figure it out. It has been one of the things that have surprised me most about this. I thought Ireland would be quite the opposite, to be honest with you. Given as a country we've always been so open to travel. The number of Irish people who have had to move abroad, myself included, for work. And I haven't been able to go back to Ireland. I haven't been back. I haven't been in Ireland since February of last year. And I used to travel into and out of Ireland on a regular basis. So I don't understand it, and I think it's something that we do have to address. I think everybody understands that we had to take measures to protect people early on. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But, once we've seen things change, I think we have to move forward and recognise that as advances are made, we start removing the restrictions that are in place. And I don't see what the fear is about allowing people, for example, who are vaccinated enter the country. There's very, very little risk associated with that. And the data shows that. The number of people who have tested positive having entered the country and gone into quarantine is very, very low. 3% is not a figure that I would consider to be high in any way. 97% of people were fine. And as I said, the data is consistent, slightly different, but a much bigger database in the UK where it's 2.5%. That is perfectly manageable. For a country like Ireland and a country like the UK to be able to manage the risk associated with that without shutting down the economy and putting so many jobs at risk as a result.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Thank you, Chair.
One point. You spoke about the Heathrow routes coming out of Shannon, and am I correct in saying that if you haven't a cabin crew based in Shannon itself, it's more difficult to run the early morning flights? Is that a reasonable statement by me?
Not necessarily, because if you're operating between Shannon and London, given that there isn't a London cabin crew base, there used to be many years ago, or a Shannon cabin crew base, you're going to have cabin crew and indeed pilots staying in a hotel somewhere. So it's not unusual, to have that. And in fact, in the case of the Dublin Heathrow service, there are often pilots and cabin crew in hotels in London to enable the early morning departures out of Heathrow into Dublin. So it's not impossible to do it.
But it's obviously easier.
I think the question is right. It adds complexity, but to be honest,
well, you'll appreciate it. You appreciate that we like to see in terms of, you speak about certainty, gives that added certainty with having a cabin crew based in Shannon. You'll appreciate that. Yeah.
No, but let me, so as a business person, I'll answer that by saying, you have certainty by guaranteeing that the routes that you serve are financially viable.
Yeah.
So it has to be looked at from a cost point of view as well.
Opening up, yeah. I'll now move to Deputy James O'Connor. Deputy O'Connor, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I just want to say, Mr. Walsh, it's a pleasure to have you before the committee. I think as one of the country's most eminent experts in the area of aviation, from your role as CEO of AIG, Aer Lingus and British Airways, I have a huge interest in having a bit of dialogue today with you regarding some of these issues. But I just want to say first and foremost, Chairman, in relation to the 138 cabin crew and 60 ground staff that are affected by the Aer Lingus decision in Cork, that it is deeply regrettable that this has happened. My own personal view is that this was avoidable. It's something that I'm delighted to hear you referencing, Mr. Walsh, is around the attitude that has developed in the Republic of Ireland around flying is something that I find incredibly hard to digest. And in terms of the damage that it is doing to our economy, to inward investment in the country, and of course the outbound tourism aspect, which was very important to many of the tour operators, which this committee has regularly hosted, that many of now are going bust, which is shocking. And of course, in the context, I think there's over 140,000 people working in the area of aviation. I just want to put a couple of very select questions to you, as somebody who's been working very hard behind the scenes to try and advance the reopening of aviation in Ireland. The first of which is in the context of the digital green certificate. In terms of your read of the DGC at the moment, how do you think that's going to work in a situation where you have a family of 5 flying from somewhere like Cork Airport to, for example, to Paris? if they're going to a trip to Disney World or Disneyland. How does that work in a situation where the two parents may be vaccinated but the children are not? And how do you foresee that situation working out when the DGC is implemented by the European Union?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm pleased to say that IATA has a solution for that. We have a system called Thematic, and in fact, there's an Irish colleague of mine who's heavily involved in running that. Thematic is a central database which includes all requirements. These are typically passport and visa requirements, but have been extended to include health requirements as well. That can be accessed by airlines. And in other words, governments can put the requirements in there. And in many cases, children will not need to show evidence of vaccination to be able to travel with their parents. And that's already been stated by several countries. And what we're doing is developing this app, which airlines can integrate into their own app. So there will be, you're not going to have to go to several different sources. If you're an Aer Lingus customer or even a Ryanair customer and you're using their travel app to check in, to fly, it can all be done through the airline's app, and it will demonstrate on departure that you meet all the requirements for entry into the country that you're travelling to. And with the agreement of governments, and we are engaging, as I said, with governments around the world, yeah, you'll be able to demonstrate on arrival as well as you're going through immigration, where immigration measures are in place, that you meet the requirements. And it can be done through, one person doing it for the whole family, or, there can be several ways of doing it. So I believe we have digital solutions either in development or available to us today that will enable people. And we're very conscious at IATA to be able to facilitate families travelling.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. And just on the point of the engagement, you spoke there saying that you have not been able to speak, I think, with government yet in your role. This is something I have referenced repeatedly to the Minister for Transport, the Minister of State with responsibility for aviation. It's around stakeholder engagement. And I want to make absolutely categorically clear as a government TD that has to happen. And people like you need to be listened to in terms of the decision-making process around reopening. And can I put the question to you? Do you think that Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, as an island nation on the western periphery of Europe, is in any way in a similar trajectory to our European neighbours around the reopening of aviation?
No, I regret to say that I think Ireland is going to lag, and certainly all the evidence shows that Ireland is lagging other European countries who have already taken steps or have announced that they intend to take steps. I think Ireland, when I look at what's happening, is still debating some of these issues, and therefore does risk being left behind as the rest of Europe starts moving forward, and indeed not just EU countries, but other countries around Europe and around the world. I should say, by the way, that I've not been critical of the Minister for Transport because I have not sought to meet with him. I know Minister Donoghue has reached out to me early in my appointment here at IATA to say he's available. But as I said, I'm 6 weeks in here. I've got a long list of things to do, and I took the opportunity of being invited to appear before this committee as giving me the opportunity.
Mr. Walsh, we deem it as a great honour that you've come before us here today, because we've been doing a huge amount of work on aviation. We want to work to get it reopened as safely as possible. We see you as a key component in that. So that you took up our offer of the invite, we're delighted to have you here today. And we're hoping from this meeting this will feed into government policy, and we'll get common sense, practical, safe solutions about the reopening of the sector. So we're delighted to have you here. Deputy O'Connor?
Chairman, yes, just to finalise and to support your comments there, Chairman, you're spot on. But also, the one thing I've been trying to get established answers on, and I'm finding incredibly difficult, and perhaps you may have a read on this at a European level from your engagement with on an international basis, Mr. Walsh, in terms of Ireland's connection with the United States of America, in terms of reopening that air bridge across the Atlantic to North America, to Canada and the United States. Where do you see at the moment where that's going? Have you any evidence to suggest that the Commission are close to brokering a deal on lifting the presidential ban in terms of European passengers being able to fly to the United States? Also, the question I need to ask, in terms of Schengen, this is a matter I raised in the Dáil. I think that the Deputy McNamara joined in as well that evening in the Dáil on my question. But in relation to the transatlantic aspect in terms of Irish passengers going back into the United States, what is your knowledge around diplomatic efforts being done by the Commission, and will Ireland be excluded as a non-Schengen country? Do you feel that that's something that we need to be watching as a Transport Committee?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's Section 212F of the Immigration Act that imposed the restriction. And if you remember, it was put in place for Schengen before it was put in place for Ireland and the UK. I think it was about a week after the US government imposed the restriction on Schengen countries that they imposed it maybe even 2 weeks on Ireland and the UK. So I don't think Ireland is at risk of being left behind. I know that the US is considering it, but I'm not sure the appetite is very strong. I think if there's a move that this has to be done on a reciprocal basis, I think that would, for Ireland certainly, that would be regrettable, because I think we've got to recognise that there's huge value to Ireland in having inbound US tourism. They tend to be the most valuable tourists that we get into the country. There's a very short summer season that we can take advantage of if we get things moving. Equally, I understand as an Irish citizen, I'd love to be able to travel into the US because I've got business there. So it's not nice being restricted, but I think we've got to be pragmatic about this and put the interests of the country, and I think the interests of the country are best served by allowing US citizens who will have freedom to travel into and out of the US without restriction because they're vaccinated, to allow them access into Ireland, because certainly other European countries are going to do it.
Thanks very much, Mr. Walsh. And my concluding remark, I think, in response to everything you have said, I think we have now reached a tipping point in terms of the economic damage that has been done by our current policies in the area of aviation, whether it's mandatory hotel quarantine or response to antigen testing versus that of the public health question. And I think we've waited long enough to take action. This committee, across party, both opposition and government, have been very vocal on our support for aviation. But I think it's now time for those at Cabinet to recognise that, those within NEFIT to recognise that the economic damage that's been done to Ireland by our current policies has to be taken into serious consideration, particularly now we're reaching such an advanced stage in the vaccination process. And I thank you for your responses.
Thank you. I couldn't have put it better. And to be honest, I think it goes to the balance that we've argued. You've got to balance protection of lives and protection of livelihoods. And the problem we have here is livelihoods are being significantly damaged and, are likely to suffer permanent damage unless we start moving quickly.
Mr. Walsh. Deputy Darren O'Rourke.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to Mr. Walsh for attending today. I just want to cover a couple of issues, if that's okay. First of all, is just the horizon for the aviation sector in general. You say that. So I suppose my question is, when do we expect that we would be back at 2019 levels? You say it might be 43% this year. What does the horizon look like? And within that, how does Ireland compare internationally?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say. The general view is that domestic markets will recover first, and we're seeing that. Now, there's no domestic market in Ireland per se, or indeed in the UK. But if we look at big domestic markets around the world, China is back above where it was in 2019. Russia is above where it was in 2019. The US is pretty much in line with 2019. And certainly talking to CEOs in the US industry, they're confident they will have more capacity in the market this summer than they did in 2019. So domestic markets, you could argue, have fully recovered. Then the view was that it would be short-haul leisure that would recover first. And I think that was principally on the belief that the EU would open up. There would be a common regime across the EU. And that's, I think, disappointed a lot of people that we haven't seen. but that the area of business that will lag in terms of recovery will be long-haul international. Now, I think for Ireland, we're principally looking at the US. I think if we get moving and put a lot of effort in, because I think we are going to have to work hard from a tourism point of view to convince US tourists to come back into Ireland and to demonstrate to them that they're going to receive the traditional welcome, warm welcome that they get. I think there's work to be done there. So domestic markets first. So that's no help to Ireland. Short haul leisure. If we can get EU working together, there should be some benefit to Ireland. Okay. But the real benefit is long haul, and that's transatlantic. And to be honest, I don't see the Aer Lingus network recovering to where it was in 2019 until 2024, 2025. And I don't see the US airlines that served Ireland coming back quickly into the market either.
Okay, thank you for that. And that leads on to my next question, which is just in terms of the level of supports that have been offered so far internationally, and we have heard from representative groups in Ireland who have said very clearly to us that the Irish government haven't provided the scale of support that that has been provided by other states. I know you mentioned earlier on that may not be the case. I'd be interested in your perspective in relation to that. But also we have the wage subsidy support scheme, which is in place at the minute. And there are other similar schemes internationally. Where do you see the transition here like, will there be further cuts across the board? What types of subsidies or supports would be needed into the future to sustain the sector in its recovery? What does the future look like in terms of the ask from the industry in terms of state and other support?
So if I look at the markets that I'm most familiar with from my time at IAG, we had employee support schemes in the UK, Spain and Ireland. Generally similar. I'd say Ireland was probably the least attractive of the three, but not a huge difference between them all. If I then look at how airlines accessed financial support, the Spanish government put in place a loan guarantee scheme with Spanish commercial banks, which IAG accessed through Iberia and Vueling to the tune of €1 billion. So we say Aer Lingus 150 million through ISEF. Iberia and Vueling, it was 1 billion. From memory, it was 750 million for Iberia and 250 million. So these are commercial loans, but guaranteed by the Spanish state in the event of a default on the part of the company. And then British Airways accessed financing through two different schemes in the UK to the tune of about 2.8 billion. In terms of scale, obviously, Aer Lingus is smaller than British Airways or Iberia, but in terms of scale and importance, I would argue that Aer Lingus is probably of greater economic importance. So while Aer Lingus has accessed funding through ISEF, it's not on a similar scale to what's been made available in Spain or in the UK.
Thank you. And just a couple of final questions in relation to that and the piece in terms of the strategic connectivity and the importance of that for Ireland and a future possibly with a reduced aviation sector. Do you see an increased role for the likes of PSOs or state-supported and sponsored routes in cooperation with airlines? And on a separate issue then, the piece in terms of restoring confidence that international travel can happen safely, and the role of digital technology and antigen testing in that. Do you see models that are being used internationally that have done that well? Because there's there is a concern, and it is a reality, and we've experienced it last summer, that international travel might contribute to the spread of the virus, and we saw it in the west of Ireland with busloads of American tourists, and that gave rise to fear and concern amongst communities. I think we need to get to a place where we can give people confidence and assurance that international travel can happen safely. Is there tools or examples of where that is done well in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing I would say is, I don't know why we automatically assume that somebody flying in from another country is infected. In most cases, that isn't the case.
That's a fair point.
And the data actually supports that. As I've said, there's significant data now available. The UK has a bigger database that I've been able to access, but of the 150,000 people that accessed the UK in that 6 week period, 2.5% were subsequently tested positive, and half of those were in. But
the piece I'm talking about is the confidence and the perception, and how I think that's part of it. There has been a perception.
Exactly, and this is where the data is important. So, and it depends on how you want to present the data. If you present the data as being 3% were infected, as opposed to 97% weren't infected, but the evidence is that the vast majority of people weren't, and the infection rates were very low. And when you have widespread infection in the country, if you look at WHO, their recommendation is that you shouldn't stop international travel. That once the virus is in place, banning international travel has little or no impact. Now, you can argue about these, the virus, the variants of concern. That's another issue. But again, the technology with regard to the vaccines and the evidence that's available today shows that most of the vaccines, are effective against the variants. And we all know that viruses mutate. That's how viruses stay alive. And the other thing I think we've got to remember is, the deaths that have taken place are tragic, and it's a terrible tragedy for all of the families who have suffered as a result of this. But it's not just that people die from coronavirus. This is something we live with. People die from flu. We don't stop the economy every winter because of the outbreak of the flu pandemic, and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people die across the world.
And sorry, could I just interrupt you, because I'm sure I'm running out of time. Just the piece in terms of PSOs, and will there be different models of?
It's a great question. I'm not a big fan of PSOs. I think there is a role to play on certain routes where destinations are not going to be served on a commercial basis. I can't see anywhere that would apply in Ireland, because I think critical connectivity will be provided on a commercial basis. It's something that I think governments will look at, and a number of governments have introduced PSOs through this. So there is a role for PSO. I think it's a small and marginal role to play.
I will now move to Senator Buttermore. 7 minutes, Senator.
Yeah, can I welcome Mr. Walsh to the committee? Mr. Walsh, I'm sure everything you've said will be counterbalanced by NEFIT and by the Department of Health and the HSE, who will say that public health lies at the core of everything that we do. But I actually concur with you in your remarks, and I'm paraphrasing that, we have a repressive regime, and if we are to have access and involvement in the digital green certificate, and if people are fully vaccinated, then there should be no mandatory hotel quarantining, and people should be able to come and go freely. Could I ask you, in the context of your last remarks there, critical connectivity on a commercial basis, do you see a difficulty for us as an island nation in terms of connectivity in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, I see some challenges. Certainly, we're not going to have the same network, the breadth of network that served Ireland in 2019, for a number of years to come. So a number of the new destinations that Aer Lingus announced on the transatlantic, I can't see how Aer Lingus will take the risk of reintroducing those for some considerable time. And I think, you know, there was talks about direct air links to China. I don't think that's going to happen in this post-COVID environment for many years. So I think there is a risk that some of the connectivity that existed or that we hoped for is not going to be there or will not materialize in the same way. So without question, connectivity will be set back significantly and will take time to recover. And, you know, I don't see any way around that, to be honest with you.
And do you see that having the import of that in the context of foreign direct investment, in the context of the ordinary traveller travelling? How does that manifest itself, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I know from my experience when I was at Aer Lingus, the new destinations to places like Seattle, San Francisco that were building up, you know, had significant volumes of people who were travelling into Ireland on business. You know, those destinations take time to mature to a point where they're financially viable. And given that the Aer Lingus transatlantic fleet will be a smaller fleet, it means some of the destinations that were served, you know, won't be served for some time to come. And that clearly has to have an impact on foreign direct investment, because having connectivity is very important. And while this technology is great, you know, and it's enabled us to do things, it's nowhere near the same quality of having face-to-face communication. So, you know, I don't buy into the idea that all business now will be done over Zoom or Teams or something else, because the quality of interaction is nowhere near as good as when you have people sitting in the same room.
So say all of us.
So, Chairman, the minimised connectivity, Chairman, is something we as a committee should take up again post Mr. Walsh's presentation today. Mr. Walsh, I concur with you completely in terms of the vaccination bonus. It's meant to be that, a passport to travel, obviously safely. And I should put on record, Chairman, sorry, at the beginning of my meeting, that I did receive a briefing from Mr. Peter O'Brien and Simon McNamara of IATA, and I want to compliment Mr. Walsh on their, and I put into the chat group the IATA Travel Pass video, which I think is very good, and which is one that we should, as a committee, explore as well. I should have done at the beginning, Chairman. My apologies for that. Mr. Walsh, the context of the air bridge for both Europe and the transatlantic one is one that I'm concerned about in the context of Aer Lingus particularly. And you smiled at the deal you got in the context of the sale of Aer Lingus. And those of us who were members of the Oireachtas then, Senator Crockwell perhaps was one of the only ones who opposed the sale of Aer Lingus with former Senator Barrett. Many of us were concerned about the Heathrow slots. Do you think now that Aer Lingus will hold firm to their connectivity for Ireland and the importance of Ireland, the importance of Aer Lingus to Ireland? Where does that stand now?
I don't think it's changed. Obviously, I can't speak for Aer Lingus or for IAG, but you know, you will have heard some of the comments I made while I was CEO of IAG, that I saw Aer Lingus as the star performer in the group. You know, we were absolutely delighted with the progress. We delivered on all of the commitments we gave, and in fact exceeded them. You know, we expanded the transatlantic network faster and way beyond what was originally anticipated. And that was under both the leadership of Stephen Kavanagh when he was the CEO, and then Sean Doyle, who took over from Stephen, Sean, as you know, is now the CEO at British Airways. Yeah. So, you know, I think there's still significant influence within IAG in relation to Aer Lingus. But, you know, Aer Lingus has been damaged. The reputation of Aer Lingus has been damaged as a result of what Ireland has done. And that is something that, you know, will take time to repair. But I can assure you that there's, you know, from my knowledge, there's still a great commitment to Ireland on the part of Aer Lingus.
And I have just two small questions, Chairman. From your piece, Mr. Walsh, where you said you hadn't any engagement with government other than Minister Donoghue, I assume NEFIT did not engage with you or any of your representatives?
No, I'm not aware of anybody engaging. And you know, I'm very happy to debate, and I think we do need to challenge NEFIT. You know, they should be open to challenge, and we shouldn't be afraid to, you know, to push back on the decisions that they have taken. You know, I deal with risk, or I did in my career as a pilot, as an operating pilot, as a CEO. I think many of these people are their attitude to risk is very different. And, you know we have to operate in an environment where we're managing risk. But to believe that we can have a zero risk environment, I just find that, impossible to accept. And the impact that attitude has had on some of the decisions that has been taken in Ireland, I think is deeply regrettable.
Well, of course, Chairman, we had some people in the Oireachtas and in this committee who were all for mandatory hotel quarantine, were for a zero approach to COVID, and look where that got us. But my final contribution, Chairman, is in the context of the European Union, Mr. Walsh, in the digital green cert or the COVID passport, I have a worry that we won't be ready as a country. Have you any comment on that from your vantage point in terms of our preparedness and our supposed conservative approach to the digital green certificate?
Well, the one thing I think Ireland as well is in relation to digital industry. We're world leaders. I don't see why we should be concerned about that. Now, I know, there's a particular crisis in relation to, the cyber attack at the moment. And I'm sure everybody is hopeful that we overcome that very quickly. But, I'm confident that we can address these issues.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Thank you, Chairman.
Just on a note, we engaged previously with the CEO, the CMO, Dr. Tony Houlihan, on testing and on the whole area with aviation. We've an invite to him. We hope he'll come in before us again. I think it would be hugely important, and we very much welcome him coming forward. Can I just clarify one or two points with you, Mr. Walsh? The first thing is, how has the approach from the authorities here damaged Aer Lingus? Practically, how has it damaged it? Secondly, you made reference to that you think it's highly unlikely that US airlines will come back into Ireland in the not too distant, for a period of time. When do you expect them back? Thirdly, you made reference that the supports coming in Spain to Iberia were much larger than here. Can you define that? And finally then, if we look at the landscape in Ireland over the next year or two, what airlines will be flying in and out of Ireland? Will be very much dependent on our, dare I say it, indigenous airlines. Ryanair are based here. We still look on Aer Lingus as a national carrier. It's been there and it's still with the Irish public. They provide a very good service. So if you could just, because when you were speaking there and you were just detailing it, do we have a situation that's critical to us that Aer Lingus and Ryanair come through this and are supported in a large way? So if you could just deal with those points, but I'm looking at it in the context of how we ensure, and you spoke about the reduction in the number of service. Is that a reduction in the number of planes that airlines will fly? Is that a reduction in the number of routes? And just give us an idea of what we have to do initially, obviously, with the reopening. And I think, like everyone else, we want a safe reopening, but we want it done in a practical way. Even you made reference, there may be occasions where there is a need for quarantine. But in the general way now, with the vaccinations and the reduction and the empirical evidence, it's not needed as a general policy. And antigen testing come on board. So if you could just, I know I'm asking a lot of detail, but it's hugely important, I think, in an Irish context. In government, we understand how significant the implications are for Ireland. We're an island nation, and I was only reflecting, we have huge, large airlines based here in the likes of Ryanair and Aer Lingus. So can you just give me that context? I know I'm asking a lot, but I think it's the key.
Okay, in relation to what has damaged Aer Lingus, I go back to what I said. The recovery is likely to be domestic markets, short haul, and then long haul. Aer Lingus has a huge dependence on its transatlantic market, which has been very successful. So the recovery will take longer for Aer Lingus. And as I said, the real concern I have is that the message coming out of Ireland has been very, very negative, much more so than other countries. There has been this attitude of anybody who has travelled into Ireland has to be infected, and therefore we shouldn't allow anybody in. I haven't witnessed that to the same degree in any other country, I've been dealing with. So I think it's been, particularly damaging to the reputation of Ireland as a destination country, which it is. We depend heavily on inbound traffic. In terms of US carriers, my point is that, there was a lot of competition on the transatlantic, a lot of services being provided by US carriers. I don't see them providing the same level. They will serve Ireland, but not to the same degree, not with the same frequency of service, and probably more on a seasonal basis than on a year-round basis, which I think is a real risk. So it'll be a delay. In some cases, it will probably mean that some of the airlines that we're serving won't serve Ireland as a destination, or may only serve it on a seasonal basis. And in terms of support, maybe the best way to put it is, if I look at Iberia, it's probably twice the size of Aer Lingus, but received, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the level of financial support, 5 times the level of financial support that they got from the Spanish government.
Mr. Walsh, what form did that take?
It was commercial loans from Spanish banks, but what encouraged the Spanish banks to provide the loans to Iberia, the Spanish state provided the banks with a guarantee of 70% of the loan in the event of a default by the company taking the loan. The Spanish banks were taking a commercial risk as well in that if there was a default, but they weren't taking a 100% risk. It was 5 times. And I very, very much appreciate, I forget that I'm no longer working for Aer Lingus or IAG, but while I was there, it's great to see the government through ISIP supporting Aer Lingus, but it was on a smaller scale than...
And 2 final things. If you look at the airlines that will be flying in and out of Ireland in the next year after it's reopened, who will those airlines be outside of Aer Lingus and Ryanair? Will it be predominantly those? And in terms of percentage of reduction in routes, what will be the percentage reduction in the size of these airlines and the number of routes they're flying over the next year?
I suspect it'll be about 30% smaller, and that will impact on destinations that are being served, frequency of services, seasonal versus year-round, 3 days, 5 days a week instead of weekly or a daily service. It's going to take a number of forms. But based on what I see at the moment, about a 30% reduction.
And the airlines that will be flying?
I think there will be fewer of them. Now, the good news for you is that, Aer Lingus and Ryanair together probably represented about 80% of the year-round capacity. But a critical 20% provided by a number of other airlines. But some of those, won't serve Ireland because the market is too small, and certainly, the recovery is probably going to take longer in Ireland.
So Ryanair and Aer Lingus and Ryanair are critical for our...
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just Aer Lingus. I know we speak a lot about Aer Lingus because of my association with Aer Lingus in the past, but Ryanair is equally critical. And, I agree with everything Michael O'Leary has said, and I don't think he's saying anything that's different to what I'm saying in relation to what has happened and what needs to happen.
If you had one ask of government, and they're now sitting down in Cabinet over the next couple of days to make that monumental decision in terms of the reopening of the aviation sector, what would be that ask, Mr. Walsh?
Just open up, take the risk, because I think it's a managed risk, and don't be overly influenced by the medical no-risk approach.
Thank you.
Senator
Crockwell, my apologies. Senator Crockwell.
I just want to say to Mr. Walsh, thank you very much for coming here today. I didn't engage in questions with you because there were colleagues here who live in towns that are very close to airports and the like, but your contribution was fantastic. I think it has given us a lot to work with and a lot to think of. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you, Chair, for allowing me in there.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh, we want to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I think this is a mutually beneficial meeting. I see it at the start of a number of engagements. I'm assuming there'll be follow-up with government. I think that's hugely important. And let's hope that over the next week we'll see a reopening plan. It's in a safe way where our aviation sector can get off the ground and we can get back to what we do well, which is being a small open economy. There's 140,000 people employed in aviation. We as a committee, and we're a cross-party committee, would really put the government that we need now to look at the reopening. Look at, by all means, quarantine, but it has to be in very, very limited cases. Look at expanding testing into the antigen area and looking at PCR instead of quarantine, and very much ensuring that we have, I suppose, a viable and secure airline and connectivity into the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, John.
The meeting is now adjourned. The next meeting will be next Tuesday, 25th of May. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Walsh.